Take her weapons, all of them." The order cut through the armory like a blade. 4 Navy commandos grinned as Staff Sergeant Elara Vance unstrapped her M4, her sidearm, even her combat knife, laying them on the counter one by one under 100 watching eyes. From the upper observation deck, a figure in plain clothes leaned on the rail, saying nothing. Elara recognized him instantly, Colonel Adrian Holt, her former NATO commander. The challenge wasn't just surviving the drill anymore. It was proving she could dismantle 4 armed men in a container maze with nothing in her hands but time. 69 seconds. That's all she would need. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The midday sun bore down on the Redstone Joint Training Facility like a hammer striking an anvil, each blow of heat reverberating through the sprawling concrete expanse. The air shimmered with mirage-like waves, the kind that made even the toughest soldiers instinctively squint and pace themselves. Heat had a way of draining more than sweat. It stole sharpness, blurred edges, dulled instincts. But for Staff Sergeant Elara Vance, the oppressive weight of August in the south was just background noise. She stepped down from the olive-drab transport van without hurry, combat boots making a crisp, unambiguous connection with the baking tarmac. Each step was steady, deliberate, the kind of movement that didn't need to announce strength because it carried it inherently. Her woodland BDUs had seen better days. The fabric softened by years of wear, the color faded from dozens of washes. The muted tones absorbed the light rather than reflected it, lending her the look of someone who had spent more time in the field than in parade formation. Her face was calm, unreadable, eyes shielded beneath the brim of her patrol cap. There was no wasted glance toward the crowd beginning to gather near Bay 3. She walked as if on her own timetable, as though she hadn't been summoned here to become the centerpiece of a spectacle. Bay 3's outer doors yawned open, revealing the cool shadows inside. Along the periphery, personnel from multiple branches drifted toward the opening, some with coffee in hand, others abandoning whatever routine task had filled their morning. Word traveled quickly on a base like Redstone. Special assessment was the phrase that had ignited the buzz, but the more tantalizing rumor, whispered in squad rooms and over breakfast trays, was that a high-ranking duty observer was on site. That alone was enough to pull an audience. Inside, 4 Navy commandos stood near the armory counter, a loose semicircle of quiet confidence. They looked as if they belonged to the space the way predators belong to the top of the food chain. Lieutenant Mason Cade was at the center, tall, athletic, with pale blue eyes that swept the room like radar. The cut of his combat shirt was immaculate, and there was a precision to his stance that came from years of drilling dominance into muscle memory. To his right loomed Chief Ryland Dean, broader and heavier, his bulk radiating the kind of blunt force capability that didn't require speed to be dangerous. On Cade's left was Petty Officer Jace Rourke, wiry and coiled, a grin hovering just shy of open mockery. The smallest movement, a shift of weight, a glance toward the onlookers, carried a spark of showmanship. Beside him, Corporal Noah Varga was all restless energy, fingers drumming on the counter in an uneven rhythm, knees flexing slightly as if his body couldn't accept stillness for more than a heartbeat. Together, they had the air of men who had been through real storms and come out certain of their place in the hierarchy. The moment Elara crossed the threshold, Cade's attention locked onto her. He didn't look surprised, just mildly entertained, like a host welcoming an unexpected but harmless guest. His voice carried cleanly across the space. "Well, look what we have here," he said. His tone dipped in the sort of friendliness that came with a serrated edge. "The army sent their heavy artillery for a simple timed breach drill. That seems..." Excessive. The remark drew a ripple of low amusement, scattered chuckles rolling through the small knot of onlookers. Ilara didn't offer so much as a twitch in response. Her face remained a mask of composure, unreadable and unbothered. Without altering her pace, she covered the remaining distance to the counter, neither rushing to close the gap nor slowing to make a point. When her eyes met Cade's, the contact was deliberate and steady, a cool, unblinking lock that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. Cade shifted his weight against the counter, settling into a posture that radiated studied nonchalance. It was casual but intentional, the kind of ease meant to be seen. "Tell you what," he said, pitching his voice just high enough to reach the furthest row of observers. "We'll go in with our full kit. Rifles, sidearms, knives. You." A small pause, followed by a faint lift of his eyebrows that sharpened the edge of his words. "Get to rely on whatever it is you army types rely on." The tone made the implication unmistakable, the insult wrapped neatly in the guise of fairness. "Sound fair?" It wasn't a question, not really. It was a challenge, bait tossed into the air in full view of the dozens gathered to watch. From his spot nearby, Dean's lips curved into the barest ghost of a grin, amusement flickering at the edges. Rourke didn't bother to hide his, while Varga's restless shifting seemed to pick up an almost eager rhythm, his stance tightening like a runner waiting for the signal to go. By the bay doors, the warrant officer stood as if carved from stone, his arms unmoving but his expression tightening. The fine lines around his mouth deepened, a silent marker of disapproval. He was a man who lived by structure and code, and Cade's little performance ran directly against the grain of every protocol that governed these inter-service drills. "Lieutenant," he began, voice edged with warning, but Cade was already turning toward him, his pivot smooth, almost dismissive, as if the interruption were an inconvenience rather than a caution. "Sir," Cade said, infusing his voice with just enough deference to mask the manipulation, "this isn't just a drill. It's a chance to measure raw adaptability under pressure. No scripts, no comfort zone. With the brass watching, that's a valuable test." He flicked his gaze upward, toward the observation deck, a quick signal that he knew exactly who was up there and what would impress them. The officer hesitated, weighing the room. The hum of conversation was a physical presence now, the kind of collective energy that could turn on you if you tried to smother it. He gave a small, almost weary exhale. "Sergeant Vance," he said at last, voice stripped of anything but formality, "for this exercise you will surrender all weapons. The commandos will proceed as equipped." The decision hit like the report of a gavel. A ripple of anticipation coursed through the onlookers. The four Navy men exchanged satisfied looks. Not the rowdy cheer of a joke landed, but the subtler satisfaction of hunters who had just been told their quarry would be limping. Ilara didn't argue. She didn't ask for clarification. She moved to the counter, unfastening the retention strap on her holster. The Sig Sauer P320 came free with a clean, practiced motion, its weight leaving her hip and settling on the hard surface with a dull metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The M4 followed, unshouldered, and laid down with the care of someone placing a tool back into its case. Last was the combat knife, unclipped from her vest, the serrated edge catching the overhead light for a brief, sharp flash before it joined the rest. The crowd leaned forward as if proximity could amplify the moment. Across from her, Cade folded his arms, the corners of his mouth tugged upward. Rourke and Varga were both smiling outright now. Dean didn't smile, but his eyes followed every movement she made, cataloguing her with the cool detachment of a man already picturing how this would end. When her hands were empty, Ilara straightened, her posture neither defensive nor challenging, simply complete. She gave no sign that she considered herself disadvantaged. If anything, the stillness in her frame carried an almost imperceptible shift, as if something inside had locked into place. Outside, the heat still pressed against the world, but inside Bay 3, the air had changed. Whatever this special assessment was supposed to be, it had just been given a sharper edge. And somewhere above, behind the wire mesh of the observation deck, the unseen observer remained motionless, watching every move. The moment Alara turned from the armory counter, the noise of the bay seemed to flatten. It wasn't silence, not truly, but the chatter and scattered laughter that had hovered in the air became distant, muffled, as if someone had closed a heavy door on the world. She crossed the open floor toward the looming entryway of Training Bay 3, her boots striking the polished concrete with the same unhurried rhythm she had carried from the van. The bay's massive doors rose like a steel cliff, their shadows spilling over the entrance and swallowing her in one step. Heat fell away instantly, replaced by the cooler breath of the cavernous interior. The smell shifted too. The scorched tarmac and diesel tang outside gave way to the scent of metal, cold steel, rust hidden in seams, faint traces of oil and disinfectant from maintenance crews. Inside, the space opened into a controlled chaos of cargo containers. Stacked 2, sometimes 3 high, their corrugated sides rose into a lattice of narrow alleys and abrupt dead ends. The arrangement wasn't random. Whoever had designed this layout understood claustrophobia and confusion, understood the way angles could turn a person around, how sound could bend and lie in a place like this. Overhead, fluorescent tubes ran in broken lines, their light casting pale slabs of illumination separated by pools of shadow. In those shadows, the details of the steel wall seemed to dissolve into blackness. Corners became voids. Gaps between containers stretched into something deeper than they were. The geometry itself was a weapon. Alara paused just inside, letting her eyes roam without moving her head. Years of training had burned the habit into her: map before you move, read before you act. She caught the faint scuff marks on certain container corners where boots had turned too fast, the irregular wear patterns on the floor where traffic had funneled again and again, the tiny chips in paint at shoulder height from rifles and gear brushing past. The bay wasn't just a maze, it was a record of every run before hers, written in the language of friction and mistake. She didn't need to know the whole map, she only needed to know enough to own it when the time came. A voice, low and clipped, crackled from somewhere deeper in the bay. One of the commandos doing a comms check. It was too faint to make out words, but the rhythm told her what she needed. They were already coordinating, already shaping their plan. They expected her to move fast, to try to outrun them deeper into the maze. They were setting their hooks for that reaction. She stepped forward, the muted thud of her boots swallowed by the steel walls around her. That was when she looked up. Running the length of the left wall, a narrow catwalk clung just beneath the ceiling. The mesh sides were taut, the steel grate floor gleaming in the fluorescent light. From there, an observer could track the entire exercise, see over the containers, watch movements unfold in real time, judge every turn and mistake without obstruction. At the railing, one figure stood apart from the other silhouettes. Civilian clothes, plain white shirt, khaki slacks. But the posture was military to the bone. Shoulders squared in perfect alignment. Spine held with an unconscious exactness. Chin angled to take in the full sweep below without wasted motion. Salt and pepper hair, clipped short to regulation length, framed a face cut from decades of command, deep lines carved by more than age, by decisions, by the weight of consequences. The way his hands rested lightly on the rail was telling: no nervous flex, no idle fidget, just the loose control of someone who could go from stillness to action in a breath. Colonel Adrian Holt, the name flashed through her like a switch closing a circuit. Memories came in fragments. The NATO task force's training grounds half a world away. Holt's voice calling corrections that cut sharper than any reprimand. Nights spent running drills until muscle trembled and mind screamed, the rare measured nods he gave when you'd done something exactly right. Holt didn't watch drills like this for entertainment. If he was here, it meant the scenario had been built for a purpose. And if she was in it, unarmed, surrounded by 4 overconfident Navy operators, it meant she was the subject of that purpose. Her eyes didn't linger long enough for anyone in the crowd to trace their path, but in that brief heartbeat, the space between her and Holt carried a weight that needed no words. It was an exchange stripped to its essence. His look telling her this wasn't a Navy matter. Wasn't about inter-branch rivalry or wounded pride. It was something far more precise, a test once again of whether she could think clearly, adapt instantly, and execute flawlessly when every layer of safety had been peeled away. The sound of measured footsteps behind her broke the moment. She shifted her attention down to the bay floor, where the 4 commandos had taken up position just outside the mouth of the container maze. They stood in a loose, angled stack, K'd at the point. Their approach was unhurried, a kind of calculated calm that spoke of certainty. Confidence radiated from the set of their shoulders, from the way their weapons sat against their bodies, as if they were walking into a conclusion already written. Under the cold glare of the overhead lights, every detail seemed sharper, the polished grips of their sidearms catching glints of white, the dull sheen of combat blades strapped tight to their thighs, the matte weight of their rifles resting in hands that had carried them through dozens of drills, fully armed, fully at ease. A ripple of quiet commentary passed through the semicircle of onlookers clustered around the entry zone. Soldiers in green fatigues, sailors in deep navy blues, a scattering of airmen in lighter uniforms, all craning subtly for a better view. Body language spoke volumes, crossed arms from those who doubted, faint curling smirks from others, eager to watch the outcome they thought was inevitable. The earlier taunts from the Navy side had done their work, expectations had been set, and now the crowd was poised for validation. Ilara offered them nothing. No theatrical glare, no deliberate roll of the neck to suggest she was ready. She simply eased a fraction closer to the mouth of the first shadowed lane between containers, her stance shifting so that all 4 operators stayed within the sweep of her peripheral vision. It was movement without flourish, the kind that didn't invite applause, but in the language of combat, it was pure readiness. Above, Holt remained motionless, his attention steady. The whistle hadn't blown yet, but the test had already begun. The sharp trill of the whistle split the air like a fault line, and the room's atmosphere shifted in an instant. Every casual lean, every half smirk in the crowd froze as the 4 Navy operators surged forward as one. Cade took point with the confidence of a man who had run hundreds of clears. His rifle stayed low and ready, the stock snug in the pocket of his shoulder, muzzle already tracking the first left-hand turn. Dean was glued to his flank, a moving wall of muscle and discipline. Rourke followed close, body language taut but fluid, scanning the angles as though daring something to appear. Varga anchored the rear, his restless energy now channeled into an overcompensating vigilance, eyes darting, boots striking the deck in quick, almost impatient cadence. They moved like a single organism, entering the container maze through the wider left corridor. The metallic ring of their footfalls bounced off corrugated steel walls, folding in on itself until it became an echoing drumbeat. Their voices dropped to clipped murmurs over comms, barely audible even to one another. Ilara didn't shadow them directly. She peeled away from the open lane, sliding into a narrow gap between 2 containers barely wider than her shoulders. The fluorescent light from the bay doors cut off within 2 steps, replaced by the dim, uneven wash from overhead tubes that skipped entire sections of the aisle. In those darker pockets, her form blurred into the background. This wasn't flight, it was positioning. Every noise in the maze carried a signature, and she listened with the focus of someone tuning an instrument. The clang of a boot striking a slightly warped steel plate told her where weight was falling. The difference in tempo between two sets of steps told her who was adjusting pace and who wasn't. Even the faint click of a sling buckle grazing a container wall mapped the team's trajectory in her mind. Years of operating in confined environments had taught her that vision could betray you, light could shift, shadows could deceive, corners could conceal. Sound was harder to disguise. Sound told the truth if you knew how to hear it. She paced her movement against theirs, staying parallel but offset, letting the labyrinth act as an acoustic grid. As the Navy formation advanced deeper, she stayed invisible, slipping between alleyways with just enough speed to keep them within a precise radius. Varga, at the tail, began showing the first cracks in discipline. Each time the team rounded a bend, his muzzle dipped fractionally as his head jerked toward a different sound. The problem wasn't his reflexes, they were sharp enough, it was the lack of rear security. His attention remained locked forward, trusting too much in the three bodies ahead of him. Alara let the opportunity mature. She tracked them through two more turns, adjusting her approach to intersect their route from an oblique angle. The floor beneath her boots was cold and hard, her footfalls absorbed by the scuffed rubber matting in certain sections. The air between containers was cooler, denser, smelling faintly of oil and rust. When they swung left into a slightly wider lane, she was already in position. The narrow slit she stepped from spat her directly into Varga's blind zone. Her left hand shot out, clamping over the barrel of his rifle, locking it immobile before he could pivot. The instant resistance triggered a reflexive pull, but she rotated her grip, levering his arm upward into a sharp, unforgiving torque. His breath caught in a short grunt as his own forward momentum carried him off balance. She pivoted, letting that momentum feed into the maneuver, guiding his shoulder toward the wall with a decisive shove. The steel sang with the impact, a low, resonant clang. His knees bent involuntarily under the force, the rifle slipping from his grasp. Her right hand was already there, stripping the weapon free in one fluid movement. The entire engagement lasted no more than 2 seconds. By the time the sound of the impact reached the others, she was holding his rifle like it had always been hers. The reaction from above was instantaneous, a ripple in the crowd's breathing, like a collective gasp that no one had coordinated but everyone had felt. Rourke was the first to register the break in their formation. He spun, rifle half raised, eyes cutting through the narrow aisle. His brain had barely reconciled the sight of Varga crumpled against the wall when Alara moved. She didn't fire. She didn't need to. The rifle became an extension of her body, swinging low to sweep the buttstock across his shins just above the ankle. The blow took his legs out cleanly, momentum snapping him forward. She stepped into him as he fell, catching him in a tight arm and neck lock that compressed the carotids with surgical precision. No flailing, no wasted force, just clean, controlled pressure. His hands clawed once at her arm, the motion weakening almost instantly as oxygen-starved blood failed to reach his brain. The tap came quick, 3 sharp slaps against her thigh. She released him at once, letting him collapse onto the mat with the disoriented gulping of someone clawing their way back to full consciousness. 2 down, 30 seconds gone. The crowd above was silent now, the earlier hum of easy amusement replaced by a tension so taut it felt physical. Cade and Dean were still advancing, but they had to know the formation was broken. Alara adjusted her grip on the captured rifle, the weapon settling naturally into her hands. She didn't glance toward the catwalk, but she could feel Holt's eyes on her, measuring every choice, every angle, every second. The hunt had turned. Cade heard the disruption before he saw it. The metallic report of a body hitting steel, followed by the brief, unmistakable scuffle of boots losing traction. Years of experience turned those sounds into a mental image, and it wasn't one he liked. The tale was compromised. His mind recalculated instantly. Rourke and Varga were out of sight, their channels quiet. That meant they were either down or so far disengaged they might as well be. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, shifting his elbows tighter, muzzle sweeping every gap with sharper intent. The maze ahead narrowed into a corridor barely wider than his shoulders. Overhead light poured in unevenly, making the steel walls look as if they were folding inward. Shadows pooled at floor level, and the air smelled faintly of hot dust and the chemical bite of industrial paint. Cade advanced with a controlled precision, his stride calibrated to maintain momentum without rushing headlong into a mistake. It was a careful balance, not so slow that he ceded the initiative, but deliberate enough that every step left room for an immediate reaction. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a fleeting glimpse of Dean, now sliding into position to cover the adjoining lane. The placement was intentional, their fields of movement overlapping just enough to ensure they couldn't be flanked at the same time. Dean's head dipped once in a terse, wordless acknowledgement, the sort of nod that carried both warning and trust. Then he vanished behind the corner of a stacked wall of containers, leaving Cade to continue alone. Now fully on his own, Cade pressed forward, muscles loose but ready, his pace a quiet rhythm against the deck plating. His breathing stayed under strict control, steady, shallow, each draw of air calculated to avoid the harsh rasp of exertion that could blur his hearing. The rifle hung against him like an extension of his body, its weight grounding him, the sling pulled tight across his vest so no loose strap would betray his position with an accidental scrape. That was when the space itself turned against him. The narrow corridor between two containers funneled him forward, and there, almost invisible in the shadows, the twisted edge of a warped steel panel reached out like a hidden snare. It caught the lip of his sling just barely, the resistance no more than a tug. It wasn't enough to halt him outright, but it stole the seamless flow from his stride, forcing an imperceptible hitch in his motion. The interruption lasted less than the span of a heartbeat, but in the compressed geometry of close-quarters combat, that moment was a chasm, an eternity in which advantage could swing violently from hunter to hunted. From the black seam ahead she came. Elara burst from the void like a projectile, not wild, not flailing, but with the controlled precision of a strike drilled thousands of times. Her shoulder drove into his ribs at a sharp upward angle, a targeted blow meant to collapse his base. The impact stole his balance, driving him sideways into the container wall. The rifle jolted in his hands, grip breaking as she twisted past. It hit the deck with a metallic clatter, the sound ricocheting through the steel canyon. Cade reached instinctively, fingertips brushing the stock, but her boot met it first. One decisive kick sent it skidding out of reach, spinning across the floor until it stopped against a wall 20 feet away. He went for his sidearm, but she was already inside his draw space. Her left hand trapped his wrist before the pistol cleared the holster, her right hooking behind his knee. A torque and pull sent his center of gravity forward, folding him toward the deck. She let him drop. No theatrics, no wasted follow-through, just the clean removal of a threat from the equation. Cade rolled to his back, lungs working harder now, but she didn't remain to finish him. Her purpose wasn't to tally hits, it was to clear the field. She was already gone, disappearing into another seam in the maze, the faint whisper of her movements swallowed by steel and shadow. Dean's voice came over comms, sharp, urgent. "Cade?" No answer. The chief's eyes narrowed. He'd been moving parallel through a lane that kept him within earshot of his point man, but now the silence stretched. He picked up speed, his boots striking the deck with the heavy cadence of a man who preferred confrontation to maneuver. Dean had size and reach, and he knew how to use them. The knife strapped to his thigh rode high, handle angled for a fast, underhand draw. His sidearm was secure but accessible, his hands free as he broke into a wider junction between container stacks. He caught movement, a flicker at the edge of his vision, and pivoted toward it, leading with his shoulders. Elara stepped into view, rifle slung, stance relaxed in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He didn't hesitate. He drove forward in a low rush, legs churning, arms opening to grapple. The plan was simple: get inside her range, use his mass to smother and control. The impact of 200+ pounds in full motion was something most opponents couldn't absorb, but she didn't meet him square. At the last instant, her left hand caught a handful of his sleeve, fingers locking down with vice-like precision. She pivoted on her lead foot, hips turning like a hinge, and let his own velocity dictate the outcome. The redirection was almost elegant, an Aikido throw executed with the kind of efficiency that came from absolute trust in the mechanics. Dean's boots left the deck. For a suspended fraction of a second, his weight floated over her centerline before the floor came up to meet him. The impact reverberated through the wooden platform he landed on, a sharp crack layered over the dull thud of body hitting surface. His lungs emptied in a single shocked exhale before his mind could catch up, before his limbs could find purchase to push back up. She'd taken his sidearm. The motion was so quick it barely registered, a smooth draw straight from his own holster into her hands, the muzzle leveled on him at a distance of less than a meter. She racked the slide once, the crisp, metallic snap echoing in the confined space. The whistle cut through the air, high and final. 69 seconds. The sound seemed to suspend the room. Dean lay on his back, eyes locked on the weapon aimed at him. Cade's breathing rasped somewhere deeper in the maze. Varga was still braced against the steel wall, one shoulder slumped. Rourke sat with his head tipped back, a hand pressed to the side of his neck. The observers didn't speak, didn't shift. Above, Holt remained at the railing, his face unreadable, but his gaze unbroken. Elara lowered the pistol, safetied it, and set it on the deck beside Dean. She didn't linger for applause or acknowledgement. Her breathing was steady, her expression as composed as it had been at the start. Without a word, she stepped away, moving toward the open floor beyond the maze. The hunt was over. The lesson had only begun. The echo of the whistle still hung in the air when another sound began to rise, slow, deliberate, each strike landing with the hollow chime of steel under weight. Boots on the grated staircase. Every head in the bay turned toward the observation deck. The man who had stood motionless above the drill from the beginning now descended with the unhurried certainty of someone who owned every inch of the space. Colonel Adrian Holt did not rush. He measured the distance with the same economy he applied to every movement in his career. The crowd shifted unconsciously, making a narrow path across the floor. Holt reached the deck, boots leaving the last metal step for the smooth concrete. His gaze moved without hesitation, past the scattered weapons, past the commandos still recovering, past the maze itself, until it locked onto Elara. He stopped 3 paces from her, the quiet between them so dense it seemed to mute the rest of the bay. A faint upward pull touched the corner of his mouth, but it never became a full smile. Didn't expect to see Falcon back on the mats. The name broke across the assembled personnel like a dropped charge. Murmurs rippled outward. "Falcon?" repeated in low voices, some questioning, some disbelieving. Those who had been in certain places, who had heard certain stories, felt the recognition hit harder. Holt's gaze finally broke from Elara and shifted to the 4 men still standing, or leaning, inside the maze. When he spoke, he didn't need to raise his voice. The weight behind each word carried it cleanly to every corner of the bay. "I imagine you went into this thinking it was just another inter-service exercise," he began, his tone measured, each syllable placed with deliberate precision. "And you'd be right, in part. But what you misread was the terrain. You assumed the only variables worth calculating were the ones you brought with you. Dean, still catching his breath as he leaned against the cold metal of a container wall, glanced toward Cade. The look they exchanged was brief, wordless, but heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that Holt wasn't wrong. Holt closed the distance between himself and the center of the bay, taking up a position where every eye and every security camera could fix on him. Staff Sergeant Ilara Vance, he continued, is not some random line soldier pulled from a roster to make up your numbers. She is not here to serve as a tally mark on your scoreboard. He let the words breathe for half a beat before driving the next ones in with quiet force. For those of us who've operated in NATO's more discreet theaters, she is known by another name. He paused, his eyes never leaving the men before him. Falcon. The code name seemed to hang in the air, almost tactile, before settling like a weight over the room. She served as the lead close-quarters combat instructor for a task force whose battles were fought in places like this, corridors that turned without warning, doorways that could hide anything, rooms where the air felt too tight to breathe, environments where you were often outnumbered, always outgunned, and still expected to get the job done. His gaze swept over them, steady and unblinking. Her mission wasn't only to fight. It was to make sure that every person around her could walk away alive from situations where all the odds, every single advantage, belonged to someone else. A murmur swept through the army ranks in the audience, not derision now, but the low hum of recognition. Holt's tone sharpened by a fraction. You took her weapons thinking you'd level the field. That wasn't strategy. That was arrogance. Worse, it was a failure to respect your opponent. He let that hang, scanning each of the 4 commandos in turn. You turned a drill into theater, so she turned it into a lesson. Cade's jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on a point beyond Holt's shoulder. Varga avoided looking up at all. Holt gestured toward the maze, the scattered weapons, the matting underfoot. You'll clean it. Every container wall, every square of flooring, every rail on the catwalks. You'll do it until it's fit for inspection, and you'll do it without complaint. Because you don't get to walk away from a public mistake without a public correction. The directive landed without argument. Even from across the bay, the loss in their posture was obvious, not from physical exhaustion, but from the collapse of the certainty they had carried in with them. Holt turned back to Ilara. His voice shifted, not softer, but different, the edge tempered, the words meant for her as much as for the room. I knew you'd finish it. I wanted them to see how. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The conversation between them was written in every choice she'd made since the whistle. Holt gave one small nod, then stepped aside, leaving the floor to her. Without hesitation, Ilara crossed to the weapons table. She lifted the M4, checked the chamber out of habit, and slung it across her back. The sidearm followed, sliding into the holster with a single practiced motion. The knife clipped back into place. Each action was precise, unhurried, absent of any showmanship. When she finished, she adjusted the sling once, then turned toward the open doors. She didn't look at the 4 Navy men, didn't acknowledge the crowd. Her boots met the sunlight outside, and the bay exhaled as though released from a held breath. Inside, the commandos began their work. Ilara crossed the threshold of Bay 3 without looking back. Outside, the sun struck like a physical force, the white glare off the tarmac momentarily sharpening every shadow, every edge. The heat folded around her shoulders, heavier now that she'd stepped from the cool steel cavern, but she walked as though it were nothing more than air. Her boots found the concrete path that cut straight through the heart of Redstone Joint Training Facility. The walkway was lined with young soldiers and sailors who, less than half an hour ago, had been leaning toward the bay doors with smirks and side bets in their voices. Now those same faces were set in an unfamiliar stillness. She didn't meet their eyes, but she felt the shift in them, the quiet that had weight, the posture unconsciously straightened, the subtle turn of heads that followed her progress. A murmur rose at her back. 69 seconds, someone said, low enough to be almost swallowed by the heat shimmer. 4 of them, another voice answered, and she was unarmed, finished a third. The words passed like contraband. Not shouted, not embellished, just carried from one knot of onlookers to another, changing direction as they spread. She reached the shade of a small overhang outside the main admin building. The sharp change in temperature was almost jarring, but she didn't stop. Her destination was the armory. Inside, the familiar scent of gun oil and climate-controlled air met her. She returned each weapon to its assigned place, the M4 on its rack, the sidearm into the labeled compartment, the knife into the locked case. Every movement was methodical, the way she would after any live deployment. There was no ceremony in it, no audience. The drill had been a public spectacle, but her post-drill routine was private discipline. She retrieved her gloves from the counter, black leather, well broken in, and pulled them on, flexing her fingers once to settle them into place. Then she stepped back out into the open corridor, the bright midday light flaring against the lenses of her sunglasses as she slid them on. Behind her, Bay 3 had changed. The 4 commandos were already at work, moving between stacks of containers with mops, scrub brushes, and industrial rags. Their rifles and gear had been stowed away. The sound of bristles against matting, the squeak of wet cloth on steel, and the dull scrape of boots on concrete replaced the earlier echo of combat drills. The crowd hadn't fully dispersed. Small clusters lingered at the periphery, watching the cleanup as if it were the second act of the same lesson. Some spoke in low tones, recounting the sequence of takedowns they'd just witnessed. Others stayed silent, the image of it still too fresh to require words. By the time Ilara crossed the open stretch leading to the edge of the main quad, the story had already put down roots and started to spread like it had been waiting for the right soil. It didn't drift from person to person slowly, it moved with speed, almost with purpose. In the mess hall, 2 mechanics were already acting it out for the benefit of their table, their hands slicing through the air to mark the exact instant Varga's back hit the wall. They spoke in short bursts, their voices dropping on the important beats the way people do when they want their audience leaning in. Over in the motor pool, someone had managed to dig up security feed snippets on a tablet. The footage was grainy, the kind of low-res blur you had to squint at, but it was still sharp enough to catch the unmistakable moment Rourke's legs were swept clean out from under him. The small crowd huddled around the screen didn't seem to mind the poor quality. If anything, it added a certain rawness, proof that this wasn't staged. In the admin wing, a logistics captain had stopped in the hallway to pass the story along to an NCO who'd missed the event entirely. His retelling carried Holt's exact words about respecting an opponent, not paraphrased but delivered as if quoting scripture, the weight of them clear even to someone hearing them second-hand. By the close of the day, Falcon was back in circulation. People who hadn't spoken the codename in years found it slipping naturally into conversation. Those who had never heard it before were adopting it without hesitation, as if they'd always known what it meant. The number 69 seconds took on a life of its own, becoming a kind of shorthand. You didn't have to name the drill outright, just say the time and everyone knew. For the fresh recruits, it became a target they could picture clearly, a mark they could aim for in a profession where most legends felt impossibly distant. For the veterans, it carried a different weight, a reminder etched deep that skill wears many faces and arrogance will always, inevitably, leave you blind. Ilara didn't linger to track the ripples. Her day moved on as though nothing unusual had happened. Meetings, routine checks, a quiet dinner in the mess like any other. But everywhere she went, eyes followed a fraction longer than they had the day before. In the weeks that followed, the story traveled beyond Redstone. Other bases heard it second-hand, details bending in the retelling but never losing the core, an unarmed staff sergeant, 4 armed commandos, a drill completed in just over a minute. The embellishments would come later. Claims that she disarmed all 4 in 30 seconds, or that Holt had brought her out of retirement just for this. But the truth needed no dressing. It was already enough to shift the way people thought about the quiet figures in the room. And for those 4 Navy men, the lesson didn't end when the mats were clean. Every glance they caught in the days after carried the memory of that minute, the image of a rifle leaving their hands, the sound of the whistle cutting short what they thought they controlled. At Redstone, 69 seconds had become more than a measure of time. It was a marker, a reminder etched into the base's living memory that the most dangerous person on the field might not be the loudest, or the one carrying the biggest weapon, but the one who didn't need any of it to finish the job. Within just 48 hours, what had happened inside Bay 3 stopped being the latest round of whispered gossip and began taking on the shape of something more deliberate, a structured account repeated with enough consistency that it started to feel like part of the base's unofficial curriculum. By the end of that same week, it even had a name that stuck: the Falcon Drill. The phrase spread quickly, not because it was flashy, but because it was clean, memorable, and tied to a single moment that no one could scrub from their mind. The moment Holt called her by that code name, loud enough for everyone in the bay to hear. From then on, instructors wove it into their morning briefings as if it had always been there. They didn't embellish it or turn it into a dramatic speech. They didn't need to. They simply stated the bare frame of the event: 4 Navy operators in full combat loadout, 1 unarmed Army staff sergeant, and 69 seconds from start to finish. Those numbers, stripped of commentary, carried more weight than any story dressed up with adjectives. Word traveled outside the bay's walls, too. Training officers from other branches, Marines, Air Force, even a few from Allied forces, began phoning Holt's office to check if the tale was real. His reply never wavered: yes, it happened. No, there would be no video released. And if you wanted to understand the lesson, you'd need to hear it firsthand from someone who had stood on that floor. That absence of footage, the deliberate scarcity of proof, gave the account a sharper edge. It turned the drill into something you couldn't just watch and analyze. You had to experience it through the voice and eyes of a witness. For the 4 commandos who had been part of it, the story had a bite no formal reprimand could match. They kept showing up, performing their duties as before, but the shadow of the event followed them into every room. Instructors began pairing them with newer, less experienced teams during exercises, not to punish them, but as a living reminder of the standard they were now expected to embody, the respect they had once withheld but now had to actively model. Dean adjusted first. The throw that put him on his back replayed in his head every time he squared off in a confined space. He began asking his trainees what they saw in their opponent before engaging, not to fish for answers, but to teach them to look deeper than equipment or demeanor. Rourke grew quieter. His reflexive grin faded into something more measured. During after-action reviews, he asked more questions and interrupted less. Varga, still nursing the shoulder that had met the steel wall, put more time into rear security drills than any other part of his regimen. Cade resisted change longest. Pride had deep roots in him, but even he stopped using fair fight as a talking point. When Holt asked him weeks later what he'd learned, Cade's reply was blunt: never assume the other person is playing the same game you are. The base's curriculum committee took note. Scenarios modeled on the Bay 3 layout began appearing in inter-service exercises, not to humiliate, but to replicate the pressure of being hunted in a space you thought you controlled. The term Falcon parameters entered the training lexicon: confined space, uneven numbers, deliberate disadvantage. Holt never explained to anyone outside his circle why he'd staged it. Those who knew him well understood that his lessons were rarely about the obvious. It wasn't just about teaching four men humility, it was about showing an entire installation how quickly the balance could shift when skill met arrogance. Elara, for her part, returned to her schedule as if the drill had been any other task. She ran her sections, maintained her gear, and slipped into the flow of base life without inviting questions. She neither confirmed nor denied the wilder versions of the story she overheard in passing. One evening, about 2 weeks after the drill, she was stopped on her way out of the gym by a private from a support unit. The kid couldn't have been more than 20. He hesitated, clearly weighing whether to speak, then blurted, "Mom, I was in the crowd that day. It made me rethink some things." She didn't ask what, she just nodded once and kept walking. The lesson wasn't hers to explain anymore. It belonged to whoever had seen it and decided to apply it. By the end of the month, the Falcon drill was being used as a case study in a Joint Forces leadership seminar. The scenario was outlined without naming branches, only the parameters and the outcome. Students were asked to list every misstep the losing side had made before the whistle even blew. The top answers were always the same: underestimation, lack of adaptability, failure to control ego. It wasn't about celebrating the win, it was about dissecting the loss. The reach went beyond Redstone. At a coastal training center hundreds of miles away, an infantry platoon ran a version of the maze with their own Falcon. A sergeant who'd trained under Elara years earlier. The time was different, the details shifted, but the underlying truth held. Tools mattered, but they were never the foundation. Holt watched all this without commentary. He didn't need to narrate the arc of the lesson. Its momentum carried on its own. On the rare occasions he crossed paths with Elara in the weeks after, their exchanges were brief. A nod, a glance, nothing more. They had both served long enough to know that some professional bonds didn't require constant words. Months later, during a pre-deployment briefing for a mixed-branch detachment, a slide appeared on the screen, a simple graphic of a stopwatch frozen at 1:09. No title, no context. The room reacted in murmurs. Everyone understood. Elara sat in the back, arms folded, watching the ripple of recognition. When the briefing ended, she slipped out without anyone stopping her. The moment in Bay 3 was no longer just an incident. It had become a standard, one woven quietly into the culture of those who'd seen it and those who'd learned from its retelling. And like all the most enduring lessons, it carried no headline, no parade, no applause, just a clear, unshakable truth. Respect every opponent, adapt faster than they expect, and never forget that the quietest presence in the room might be the one holding all the advantage. By the 3rd month after the Bay 3 incident, the story had settled into the base's bloodstream. It no longer needed to be told in full to carry weight. Fragments alone could shift the air in a room. A stopwatch time, a code name, a mention of the maze. Each element was shorthand, instantly understood without further explanation. For Elara, the change was subtler. Her daily life didn't shift in obvious ways. No new rank on her chest, no reassignment, no public commendation. But the undercurrents were different. Meetings that used to open with casual small talk now began with an alert quiet. Younger soldiers listened more closely when she spoke. Colleagues who had once offered advice unprompted now asked questions instead. The armory staff now handled her check-ins with a kind of precise efficiency that bordered on something unspoken, not quite ceremony but undeniably respectful. Forms that might once have lingered in the in-tray were now stamped and filed almost immediately. Gear requests that, in the past, might have sat in limbo for days, were now processed and delivered within hours. No one called it favoritism, and she would have rejected the notion outright if they had. It wasn't about bending rules or cutting corners, it was about acknowledgement. a quiet, wordless recognition of someone whose capability had already been proven in circumstances that no written qualification could ever truly capture. Elara never used it to her advantage. She didn't adjust her expectations, didn't demand more than she had before. Her pace remained steady, her standards unchanged. She still refused to waste a single moment on anything that didn't serve the mission directly. If people around her moved a little faster, spoke with a little more care, or shifted their posture when she entered the room, that was their decision, not her request. As for the 4 Navy commandos, they became an unintentional case study in how to recover from a public loss. Holt hadn't moved them to a new post, and they never asked to be transferred. Instead, they stayed exactly where they were, training alongside the same soldiers who had watched their defeat from a few feet away. The sting of that day didn't disappear overnight, but over time the humiliation lost its edge. What remained was a kind of sharpened grit, a determination to never be caught that unprepared again. The punishment detail, long hours of cleaning and maintaining equipment, was behind them now, but the memory of it clung like a persistent shadow. It didn't weigh them down, it pushed them forward. Dean began putting his name down for mixed branch exercises he might have ignored before, embracing scenarios outside his comfort zone. Varga's attention to rear security became so consistent that instructors began pointing it out to others as an example. Rourke's trademark impulsive grin appeared less often, and when it did, it seemed aimed more at his own progress than at provoking others. Even Cade, the quietest and most guarded of the group, began to step back from speaking in absolutes during planning, a small but telling shift in someone who once believed certainty was strength. The base training schedule absorbed the Falcon parameters fully by the end of that quarter. Exercises with deliberately uneven advantages became routine. New recruits, unaware of the drill's origin, learned the scenario as a matter of course, the way a pilot might learn a specific emergency procedure without knowing who first codified it. Occasionally, Elara would catch wind of an embellished version of the story. In one, she had taken the rifle from Cade before Varga. In another, Holt had stepped in midway to test her with unexpected variables. She never corrected them. Accuracy mattered in after-action reviews. Outside that, stories had their own momentum. Holt remained a constant but distant presence. They crossed paths in passing, exchanged brief nods in hallways or on the range. Once, in the middle of a logistics meeting neither of them had wanted to attend, he'd leaned over during a lull and murmured, "They're still talking about it in Norfolk." It was the only time he'd referenced the drill to her directly since that day. Off base, the ripples traveled farther than she had anticipated. At a regional joint forces symposium, a Marine gunnery sergeant she'd never met approached her during a break. "You're Falcon, aren't you?" he asked, not as a challenge but as confirmation. When she didn't answer, he smiled faintly. "We ran your maze last month. It changed the way my guys clear corners." Then he nodded once and walked away. Back at Redstone, the culture shift was most visible in the younger ranks. They began to look at inter-branch drills less as competitions and more as learning opportunities. That didn't erase rivalry, nothing could, but it redirected the edge. Teasing became sharper but less personal. Jokes were delivered with a kind of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. Holt had achieved something that would outlast the original moment. He'd created a shared reference point that bridged uniforms. It was no longer just a Navy loss or an Army win. It was an example everyone could learn from. Elara kept her own reflections private. She didn't replay the 69 seconds in her head. She didn't mark the anniversary. What stayed with her wasn't the speed or the outcome. It was the confirmation that her training still lived in her hands and in her decisions. That was enough. In the evenings, when the base was quieter and the air finally began to lose its midday weight, she sometimes walked past Bay 3. The big doors would be shut, the interior dark except for a security light spilling a thin beam across the threshold. From outside, the maze was invisible. You could almost forget what it held. Almost. By the end of the fiscal year, the Falcon drill had crossed the threshold from story to doctrine. It appeared in PowerPoint slides at leadership courses, stripped of names and branches, the facts distilled into a set of parameters. And an objective: neutralize a fully armed four-man team in under 2 minutes, starting unarmed, inside a confined environment. Instructors didn't dramatize it. They didn't need to. The stark simplicity of the setup left no room for excuses, only for analysis. Students were told, "It has been done. Here's how the environment was structured. Here's where the losing team made their mistakes." Military schools outside Redstone began adapting the scenario to their own training facilities. Some used plywood shoot houses, others built modular container layouts based on the Redstone blueprint. The replication wasn't perfect. Every base had its quirks, but the core remained intact. The first time Ilara saw a printed training manual referencing case study F69, she was in a supply office signing out maintenance forms. The notation was buried halfway down a section on asymmetric close-quarters engagements. She didn't point it out to anyone. The code name and the time were there for those who knew. Outside the formal channels, the drill developed a quiet reputation among special operations instructors. In casual conversations over coffee or at the edge of a range, they compared how their trainees handled it, which details tripped them up, how long it took before they adapted. A few tried it themselves, often with sobering results. The Navy's own training program didn't ignore it. 6 months after the original event, a detachment from another coast requested a walkthrough of Bay 3. Their lead petty officer spoke frankly to Holt. "We don't want to repeat the mistake." Holt gave them the space for a day, said nothing about the original 4 who had run it. Holt himself never tried to capitalize on the story. He wasn't interested in turning it into a brand or a recruitment pitch. His satisfaction lay in its utility. The fact that it traveled, that it sparked professional curiosity, meant the lesson was doing its work. Privately, he considered it one of the cleanest demonstrations of principle he'd ever orchestrated, not because of the speed, but because it had stripped away everything ornamental. No complex rules, no elaborate backstory, just skill against assumption. As for Ilara, Holt noticed she never leveraged the notoriety. She didn't volunteer to teach a Falcon drill block, didn't ask for her name to be on the case study, didn't even weigh in when people speculated about details in her presence. That restraint to him was part of why the moment carried so much weight. It remained unsullied by self-promotion. He found himself reflecting on their shared past more often in the months after. He remembered her as a younger sergeant in NATO's program, methodical, sometimes to the point of frustrating him with her refusal to rush a drill until she was satisfied with her baseline. She'd been the kind of operator who could take criticism without bristling, who stored it away and returned days later with the flaw erased. Watching her in Bay 3 had confirmed nothing had dulled. The edges were still sharp, the judgment still fast, the execution still clean. In the spring, Holt received an email from a training coordinator at an Allied Nations Special Forces school. It was a brief note thanking him for permission to adapt your Falcon parameters and reporting that their first cadre had failed to beat the time. Attached was a grainy photo of their maze. Different colors, different climate, same brutal geometry. He forwarded it to Ilara without comment. She replied hours later with a single line, "They'll get faster." The reach of the drill continued to expand. By the end of the second year, F69 was referenced in after-action reviews for real-world missions where small units had to adapt under sudden disadvantage. It wasn't romanticized. Actual operations had too much at stake for that. But the principles applied cleanly. Holt saw it cited in one classified briefing for a mission that had gone sideways in a port city halfway across the globe. The team lead had written, "We applied Falcon sequencing after losing comms. It bought us the minutes we needed." On a warm evening, nearly 2 years after the drill, Holt crossed the quad toward the officers' mess and spotted Alara coming from the opposite direction. They hadn't spoken in weeks. She gave a short nod in greeting. "Still making the rounds," he said. She arched a brow. "The drill?" He nodded once. "And the lesson." Neither of them needed to say more. As they passed, Holt considered that the true legacy of Bay 3 wasn't in the stopwatch time or the number of opponents neutralized. It was in the way it had become a shared language, a reference point for adaptability, humility, and the awareness that an opponent's quiet could be as dangerous as any weapon. In his long career, few moments had carried so cleanly from a single room to the wider force. The Falcon drill had done it without fanfare, without propaganda, and without compromise. And somewhere beyond the next set of doors, in a training bay lit by flickering fluorescence and the sound of boots on steel, another unit was about to find out why. The years didn't erase Bay 3, they layered over it. Operations came and went, deployments stacked, then faded into debrief notes and archived footage. Command rotations changed the faces in offices and on parade fields. New uniforms walked the same hallways, unaware of the exact layout of the maze behind those heavy steel doors, but still speaking of Falcon parameters like a clause in a manual that had always existed. For Alara, the weight of it was never in the fame, if fame was even the right word. She didn't wake up thinking about it. Most mornings started the same way they had before, lacing her boots, scanning the day's schedule, calibrating her focus like an instrument before use. But there were moments, quiet, unplanned moments, when the echo of that day returned. Sometimes it was the scent of machine oil in a closed room. Sometimes the sound of a latch closing on a rifle sling. Sometimes it was nothing tangible at all, just a shift in the air when someone realized she was watching and adjusted what they were doing without thinking. She never chased those moments. They came to her, reminders without ceremony. The Falcon drill had long since stopped being a secret. It was a fixture in training circles, though its retelling had taken on variations. She'd overhear stories from soldiers who swore it had been a 5-man Navy team, or that she'd been given a single pistol and 4 rounds, or that Holt had run the timer himself with a stopwatch hanging from his neck. She let the myths breathe. In some ways, they did more good than the exact truth. A legend could inspire where a technical report could not. Her own role in its spread was passive. She didn't publish articles, didn't present at conferences, didn't correct instructors who misremembered the finer points. But when asked directly, she would answer, plainly, without embellishment, without self-effacement. She owed that much to the integrity of the lesson. The lesson itself was what had stayed alive, not the win, not the humiliation of the other team, but the fundamental truth that ability lives in actions, not in assumptions, that titles and patches mean less than the readiness of the mind and body in the moment they're tested. Holt understood this better than anyone. By his 3rd year back at Redstone, he'd seen the drill's framework adapted into scenarios he couldn't have. Predicted hostage simulations in embassy stairwells, armored convoy interceptions in simulated urban choke points, even naval boarding exercises on decommissioned frigates. The specifics changed, but the core, start disadvantaged, adapt fast, finish decisively, never did. One evening, during a joint exercise debrief, Holt found himself sitting next to a Marine captain who had never met Alara but spoke about her like a mentor. "We ran her drill last month," the captain said, flipping through notes. "Took us 4 tries to get under 90 seconds, harder than it looks." Holt didn't correct him on the time. He simply nodded. Across the base, Ilara's own days were shifting. She had taken on more mentorship quietly, not through formal classes but in the in-between spaces, range cleanup, post-drill equipment checks, unplanned conversations in the motor pool. Younger operators learned quickly that if she stopped to give input, it was worth listening. She never tried to replicate Bay 3 for them. You can't recreate the first strike of lightning, you can only teach them to stand ready in the storm. One spring morning, she walked the perimeter path at dawn, a mug of coffee in her gloved hand, steam curling in the crisp air. The hangar roofs caught the early light, dull grey turning gold in slow increments. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear your own boots in the gravel. She passed Bay 3 without looking in. The doors were closed, locked, the keypad light steady green over steel. The exterior looked almost plain. If you didn't know, you'd think it was just another storage bay. She stopped a few steps past it, not to reminisce, not to relive, but to mark the fact that it was still there, still ready. Elsewhere in the country, and beyond, people she'd never meet were walking into their own versions of it, unaware of the exact lineage, but carrying the DNA of that 69 seconds in their muscle memory. Holt, in his own office, had a single photo in a frame. Not of her in the drill, no photos had been taken, but of the empty maze after. No bodies, no gear, just the corridors of container walls and the faint scuff marks where boots had turned corners at speed. It was, to him, the purest record of what had happened, the environment untouched, yet permanently altered. Years later, when Holt finally rotated out for good, he left the frame in a drawer of his desk for his successor. No note, just the image. By then, Elara had turned down more than one offer to move into a higher profile role. She stayed where she was most effective, in the field, in training spaces, in the background of operations where no one noticed her until the moment they couldn't afford not to. And the Falcon drill, it kept moving, changing shape, passing from one set of hands to another, sometimes spoken of with a grin, sometimes with a shake of the head, always with a trace of respect. There was no ceremony for its anniversary, no plaque on Bay 3, no medal on her chest for that day. The legacy didn't need them. It lived in the way people trained, in the edge they carried into real-world fights, in the quiet knowledge that the impossible could be done, had been done, by someone they might have underestimated. On a late summer evening, years after it began, Elara stood alone on the catwalk above the training floor, watching a mixed team run the latest iteration of the drill. Different uniforms, different accents in their shouts, but the same raw urgency in their movement, the same sharp turns, the same reflexive communication under pressure. She offered no smile, no outward sign of satisfaction. The only acknowledgement was a single, almost imperceptible dip of her head, a quiet confirmation to herself, as the lead operator rounded the last corner and gave the all clear. It was as if lightning had struck a second time, not the identical flash as before, but close enough to throw the same sharp light across the horizon. Some events blaze hot in the moment, only to dim and vanish as quickly as they came. This was not one of them. The Falcon drill had never sought attention. There were no headlines chasing it, no speeches or banners to stamp it into official memory. Its strength lay in the way it endured, carried in the low tones of barracks talk, in the clipped phrases traded between instructors, and in the quiet preparation it sparked in those who'd never even witnessed the original test. For those who were there, the memory isn't about the stopwatch. It's about the shift in the air, that exact second when the impossible stopped being impossible. The moment a room full of trained professionals realized they had been wrong, not humiliated, not mocked, but shown that skill can live in silence, that rank and record can mean less than preparation and will. Elara never needed to defend it. She never argued with the rewrites, never chased credit when versions of the story twisted in the telling. She let the myth breathe, because sometimes the myth is what carries the truth farther. And Holt, he understood that better than anyone. He'd seen 1,000 drills come and go, but this one, it slipped the bounds of the base. It became a reference point, a standard, a private dare. Every time a team stepped into an unknown, you could see it in their eyes. The ones who'd heard the whispers, F-69. They didn't know her name. They didn't know the layout of Bay 3. But they knew what was expected of them now. That's the strange thing about legacy. You can't design it. You can't force it. You can only act in the moment with everything you have and let the ripples travel where they will. Most vanish in minutes. Some last a lifetime. Out there, right now, on some training floor you'll never see, someone is making the turn she once made, breathing hard, heart pounding, and hearing their own voice call the room secure. They may never know whose shadow they just stepped into. They don't need to. The horizon doesn't belong to the one who first lit it. It belongs to the ones who keep it lit. And so we leave Bay 3 as it is, sealed, silent, ready for whoever comes next. The doors will open again to another team who thinks they understand the ground they stand on. And then, in less than a minute, they'll understand something else entirely. That's the mark of a true defender. Not the loudest, not the one in the front of the formation, not the one with the longest list of medals, but the one who can move through the storm without warning and leave the sky clear behind them. This is Veteran Biker. You've just heard a story that began as a test and became a standard. If you've walked your own version of Bay 3, if you've been underestimated and turned it into your edge, tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been riding with us, thank you for keeping this fire lit. Like this video if the story hits you. Subscribe if you want more. And remember, not every warrior wears their stripes where you can see them. Some carry them in silence, and that silence is louder than anything else.